I took the fire lookout job because I needed to stop being findable for a while. That's not poetic. That's not some brooding declaration. It's just the truth. I'd spent 2 years in Portland working digital marketing for a mid-size outdoor brand, and by the end of it I was sleeping 4 hours a night, drinking too much, and checking my phone so compulsively that my thumb had developed a dull ache at the joint. My girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, had moved out in March, and she'd done it on a Tuesday while I was at work, which I think was worse than a weekend because it meant she'd planned it around my schedule. She wanted efficiency, not confrontation. She left the coffee maker and took the good towels. I came home to an apartment that still smelled like her shampoo but had gaps on every shelf. So when a friend of a friend mentioned seasonal positions with the Forest Service, fire lookout, remote posting, Pacific Northwest, I applied the same night. I didn't research it. I didn't ask smart questions. I just wanted to be somewhere that my phone didn't work, where no one could tag me in anything, where the main responsibility was sitting still and watching. They assigned me to Ridgeback Tower, which sat at about 4,200 feet in a section of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest that I'd never heard of. My supervisor was a man named Dale Eckhart, who drove me up in a Forest Service truck with a cracked dashboard and an air freshener shaped like a trout. He was around 60, lean, quiet, in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. He told me the basics during the drive: radio check-ins twice daily, weather logs every 4 hours, fire spotting protocols, supply schedule. Every 2 weeks a truck would come up the access road with water, propane, batteries, and canned goods. There was a solar panel and a small generator for backup. The composting toilet worked fine as long as I turned the crank every 3 days. The tower itself was a 14 by 14 cab on stilts, a standard L4 design, he said, built in the 1960s and refurbished in 2011. It sat on a rocky knob above a saddle between 2 ridges. The stairs were wooden, 53 steps in a switchback pattern, and they creaked in a way that I'd later learn to interpret like language. Inside there was a cot, a desk, a propane stove, a fire finder on a central pedestal, and windows on all 4 sides. The views were enormous. On a clear day you could see 3 volcanoes. But Dale said clear days were rare this time of year. The fog came in mid-September and didn't fully lift until November, sometimes December. He called it fog season, and the way he said it carried a weight I didn't understand yet. Before he left, he handed me a laminated sheet of paper. "These are the supplemental protocols for fog season," he said. "Read them tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." I looked at the sheet. It was not handwritten, official looking, but there was no Forest Service header, no date, no author attribution, just a numbered list, cleanly formatted, laminated in thick plastic that had yellowed slightly at the edges. "Who wrote these?" I asked. Dale was already halfway down the stairs. He paused, one hand on the railing, and looked back at me, not at my face, slightly past it, like he was checking something behind me. "Read them tonight," he said again. Then he continued down. I listened to his truck until the sound dissolved into the trees. Then there was nothing. No engine, no traffic, no hum of electricity from a neighboring building. Just wind through conifers, and somewhere far below, a creek I couldn't see. I set the laminated sheet on the desk and made coffee first. I used the little percolator that had been left by a previous occupant, along with a can of pre-ground Folgers that tasted burnt and perfect. I sat on the cot and drank it while the light changed outside, the sky going from pale gray to a deeper gray that meant the clouds were lowering. Then I picked up the sheet. There were 6 rules. I'll tell you what they said, as closely as I can remember, because I read them enough times that the phrasing is still in me. I don't have the original anymore. I'll explain that later. Rule 1. If the radio crackles 3 times in succession after midnight, do not respond immediately. Wait exactly 10 seconds before pressing the transmit button. If the crackling has stopped after 10 seconds, respond normally. If it has not stopped, turn the radio off and do not turn it back on until dawn. Rule 2. If you observe lights moving below the tower during heavy fog, close all curtains and do not reopen them until the lights are no longer audible. The word audible stood out to me. Not visible. Audible. Forest patrols do not operate after 11 p.m. Rule 3. If you observe a person or figure near the tree line, do not look at them directly. Before making visual contact, count their fingers. If you cannot count their fingers from your distance, do not attempt to close that distance. Rule 4. At 1:13 a.m., the stairs may sound occupied. Do not check. Do not open the hatch. Do not call out. Resume normal activity after the sound stops. Rule 5. If someone approaches the tower claiming to be lost, ask them which trail they came from. If they answer immediately, without hesitation, keep the door locked and do not engage further. A genuinely lost person will pause. They will be confused. They will not have a ready answer. Rule 6. The previous lookout may be heard on radio channel 2. You may listen. Do not continue the conversation for longer than 1 minute. After 1 minute, switch to channel 5 and log the time. I read the list twice and then set it down. My first reaction was practical. This was hazing. Some tradition among fire lookouts. A prank played on new seasonals. I'd heard stories about Forest Service humor, fake bear protocols, made-up radio codes. The lamination was a nice touch. I almost respected the effort. I pinned the sheet to the wall next to the firefinder and didn't think about it again for 3 days. Those first 3 days were close to perfect. I don't say that lightly. I hadn't felt that kind of stillness in years. I woke up early, made coffee, watched the light fill the valley below. I logged weather. I read paperback novels I'd brought in a duffel bag. I ate canned soup and instant oatmeal and didn't miss restaurants. The radio check-ins with dispatch were brief and professional. A woman named Linda, calm-voiced, who asked for my weather readings and confirmed the next supply delivery. I slept 9 hours a night, which I hadn't done since college. The forest below was a carpet of dark green that moved slightly in the wind, like something breathing in its sleep. At night, the darkness was total, and the stars were so dense they looked like interference. The fog arrived on my 4th night. It didn't roll in the way fog does in movies. Dramatic, sweeping, visible. It was already there when I looked. I'd been reading, and when I glanced up from my book, the windows were white. Not gradually white, solid. As if someone had pressed sheets of paper against the glass from outside. The transition had been so quiet I hadn't noticed it happening. The temperature inside the cab dropped maybe 4 degrees in 10 minutes. I put on a flannel over my thermal and sat there listening to the silence change. Because it did change. Fog has a sound, or rather, it changes the sound of everything else. The wind became muffled. The trees, which usually whispered and creaked, went almost inaudible. The only clear sounds were inside the cab. The slight hiss of the propane heater, the tick of cooling metal, my own breathing. That first fog night, I slept fine. I slept fine the second night, too. On the 3rd night, the radio crackled. I was half asleep. It was after midnight. I checked my watch, and it was 12:41. The radio was on the desk, set to channel 5, which was the General Forest Service frequency. It crackled once, then again, then a 3rd time. 3 crackles after midnight. I lay on the cot for a moment, staring at the ceiling, and felt the memory of the rule surface in my mind like something floating up from dark water. I almost laughed. I almost picked up the radio and keyed the mic to check in, just to prove to myself that this was coincidence and the rules were nonsense. But I didn't. Something in me waited. Not because I believed the rules. I want to be clear about that. I waited because the fog was thick, and I was alone, and there was no cost to waiting 10 seconds. It was the same logic that keeps you from walking under a ladder. You don't believe it matters. But the effort of avoiding it is so small that superstition wins by default. I counted to 10 in my head. The crackling stopped at 7. I picked up the radio and keyed the mic. Ridgeback checking in. Radio test. Static. Then Linda's voice, bored and clear. Copy, Ridgeback. You're coming in fine. Everything good up there? All good. Just a radio hiccup. Fog does that. Get some sleep. I did. But I noticed that my hands were slightly damp when I set the radio down, and I wiped them on my jeans before I turned off the lamp. Over the next week, the fog became my entire world. It never fully lifted. Some mornings it thinned enough that I could see the nearest trees. Doug firs, massive, their bark dark and furrowed like old faces. But by afternoon it closed back in, and by evening the cab was floating in white nothing. I began to understand why Dale had said fog season the way he had. It wasn't a weather event. It was a condition. The tower became a tiny pressurized space surrounded by blankness, and the blankness was so complete that my sense of height, of being above something, disappeared entirely. I could have been at ground level. I could have been underground. The only evidence that the world still existed below me was the staircase descending into white, and even that felt theoretical. I developed routines to fill the structure: morning coffee, weather log, radio check-in, midday reading, afternoon walk, down the stairs, around the base of the tower, never more than 100 yards into the trees, because the fog was disorienting and I didn't trust myself not to lose the trail. Evening cooking, night watch, journal entry, sleep. I wrote more in that journal than I'd written in years, not about the fog, about the marriage that wasn't a marriage, the job that ate me alive, the way I'd spent 3 years performing a version of myself that didn't have a single original thought. The tower was giving me something back. I didn't want to name it yet, but it felt like the first draft of a personality I'd lost. On the 9th night, I saw the lights. It was around 11:30. I was sitting at the desk, writing, and I looked up because the quality of the darkness outside the window had changed. The fog was still thick. I couldn't see the trees, but somewhere below and to the east there was a faint glow. Not a flashlight beam, not a campfire, a diffused, moving luminosity, like someone was carrying a lantern behind frosted glass, except the scale was wrong. It was too wide, it moved too smoothly, and it wasn't on any trail. There was no trail in that direction for at least 2 miles. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds before the second rule came back to me. Close all curtains and do not reopen them until the lights are no longer audible. Audible, that word again. I stood up and pulled the curtain closed over the east window. Then I stood very still because I wanted to test something. I wanted to know if the word audible was a mistake or if whoever wrote the rules had chosen it deliberately. The light, even through the curtain, cast a faint glow. I could see it shifting, a dim warmth against the fabric, and then I heard it. Not a sound exactly, a pressure, a low, thrumming vibration that I felt more in my chest than my ears, like standing too close to a subwoofer playing a frequency below human hearing. It was there for maybe 45 seconds. Then it faded. The curtain went dark. The pressure in my chest released like a held breath. I did not open the curtain. I closed the other 3 and sat on the cot in a cab that now felt like a sealed container. My own breathing too loud, the propane heater ticking, and I stayed like that until I fell asleep sitting up. In the morning, the fog had thinned slightly, and I looked east from the window. The trees were there. The ridge was there. Everything looked exactly as it should. I made coffee and sat with it for a long time and did not write in my journal. The next radio check-in with Linda, I asked a question I'd been composing in my head for an hour. Linda, quick question. Has anyone reported unusual light activity in the Ridgeback sector? Pause. Longer than a normal pause. Define unusual. Moving lights, below the tower, after 11. Another pause. Ridgeback, we don't have patrol activity in your sector after dark. Could be hunters with headlamps, could be backcountry campers. In this fog, people do stupid things in the woods. Log it in your report and we'll flag it for the ranger. Anything else? I said no. She said copy. The conversation ended. But here's what stayed with me. She hadn't asked me when I'd seen the lights. She hadn't asked how many, or how long, or what direction they'd moved. She'd asked me to define unusual. Like she was checking which kind of unusual I'd seen. I let it go. I told myself I was reading into things because I was alone, and the fog was messing with my sense of proportion. Isolation does that. It makes everything either too small or too significant. I went back to my routine: coffee, logs, reading, walk, soup, night watch, journal, sleep. On the 12th night, the stairs sounded occupied. I was awake. I'd been sleeping less as the fog continued, not from fear, but from a kind of low-grade alertness that I couldn't fully shut off. I was lying on the cot, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, and I heard a creak from below, then another. Then a rhythm, slow, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of someone climbing wooden stairs. Not fast, not tentative, patient, like someone who knew the stairs well and was in no hurry. I turned my head to look at my watch, 1:13 a.m. The blood left my face so fast I felt dizzy, not because I was terrified, because the precision of it, the exact time, the exact sound, matching the exact rule, collapsed every rational framework I'd been holding up. Hazing doesn't work on a schedule. Coincidence doesn't hit the minute. Something was climbing the stairs at 1:13 in the morning, and Rule 4 had told me it would, and Rule 4 had told me not to check. I did not check. I lay on the cot and listened to the footsteps climb. They were slow. Maybe one step every 3 seconds. I counted 12 steps, roughly a quarter of the staircase, before they stopped. Just stopped. No final creak, no retreat. They simply ended as if whoever was climbing had reached a step and decided to remain there. The silence after was worse than the sound, because silence meant they were still on the stairs. Silence meant something was standing on step 12 in the fog outside my tower, not going up, not going down, in the absolute dark. And it was 1:14 in the morning and I was alone. I don't know when I fell asleep. I know that I did, because I woke up at dawn with every muscle in my back locked tight and a headache that started behind my eyes and went all the way down my neck. I made coffee. I opened the hatch and looked down the stairs. They were empty. There were no footprints on the wood, but the wood was dry, which meant the fog hadn't condensed on the steps the way it usually did, as if something had been standing on them long enough to warm them. Or I was projecting. I couldn't tell the difference anymore, and that was its own kind of problem. I called Dale that afternoon on the satellite phone that was reserved for non-routine communication. It rang 6 times. Eckhart. Dale, it's the Ridgeback Lookout. I had a question about the fog season protocols. The supplemental sheet. Yeah, I need to know who wrote it. Silence. I could hear wind on his end and a truck door closing. It's been in the tower as long as I've been district supervisor. That's 11 years. I asked the same question when I started. My predecessor said it was in the tower when he started too, but it's typeset. Someone formatted it. Someone laminated it. I know what it looks like. Dale, something climbed the stairs last night at 1:13, exactly 1:13. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was flatter. Did you check? No. Good, he exhaled. Follow the sheet, all of it. Don't skip any of it, because you think you've figured out which ones are real and which ones are decoration. They're all real. I'm sorry nobody told you that face to face. That's my fault. Dale, what's on the stairs? I don't know. Nobody who's looked has given a clear answer, and 2 of the 3 people who looked didn't finish their season. What does that mean, didn't finish? They requested early transfer and got it. No disciplinary action, no formal explanation. They just didn't want to be up there anymore, and the Forest Service didn't argue. The 3rd one, he stopped. Follow the sheet. Check in with Linda on schedule. The fog will lift in 5 or 6 weeks. You'll be fine if you follow the sheet. He said goodbye and hung up. I sat with the dead satellite phone in my hand for a while, staring at the laminated rules on the wall, and I understood that I had crossed into a different kind of experience. This was not a prank. This was not a misunderstanding. Something was happening on this mountain during fog season, and the rules were the only technology anyone had developed to manage it. I followed them. Everyone. Every night. The lights returned 4 more times over the next 2 weeks. I learned to watch for the shift in the fog, a faint warming of the darkness that preceded their appearance, and I'd close the curtains preemptively. The pressure sound came with them every time, that low non-sound that sat in my ribs. Once, I pressed my hand flat against the window before closing the curtain, and the glass was warm, not hot, just warmer than it should have been on a 40-degree night with no sun. The stairs sounded occupied on 5 more occasions, always at 1:13. The footsteps never climbed past what I estimated was step 20. They never descended. They simply stopped, held, and at some point in the silence that followed I would fall asleep and wake to empty stairs. I stopped checking the stairs in the morning because looking at them made my chest tight in a way I didn't want to examine. The radio, though. The radio was where it got complicated. 3 weeks into fog season, the 3 crackle patterns started happening more frequently. Sometimes the crackling stopped within 10 seconds, and I could respond normally. But twice it didn't stop, and I turned the radio off as instructed and sat in the dark without communication until dawn. Those were the hardest nights. Without the radio, the cab felt truly severed. I was a man in a box in the sky, and the world below might as well have not existed. On the 26th night, I heard a voice on Channel 2. I hadn't been on Channel 2. I was on 5, the standard frequency, and I was reaching for the radio to log a weather reading when I bumped the dial and it slipped to 2. Static filled the cab, and then, beneath the static, a voice. Male, calm, mid-sentence, told me the same thing when I started. I didn't believe it either. The lights are the easy part. You just close the curtains and wait. The stairs are harder because you want to know. That's the whole thing, isn't it? You want to know what's standing there. But wanting to know is the mechanism. That's what it uses. I was frozen. My hand was on the dial, but I couldn't move it. The voice was conversational, unrushed, like someone talking to a friend over coffee. There was no panic in it, no distortion beyond the normal fuzz of a radio signal. The fog doesn't cause it. The fog just makes the boundary thinner. They've always been in the trees. The fog is when they can reach the stairs. I made it to October 15th before I looked at my watch. I'd been listening for 50 seconds. Rule 6 said 1 minute. I had 10 seconds. You're going to want to ask me what they are. Don't. Not because I won't tell you. Because the answer makes it worse. You're doing fine. Follow the 1 minute. I switched to Channel 5. My hand was shaking badly enough that I missed the dial on the first try. The voice cut off mid-word, and the static on Channel 5 was clean and empty, and I sat there breathing too fast for a long time. The previous lookout. That was what the rule said. The previous lookout may be heard on Channel 2. I didn't know who had been in the tower before me. I'd never asked. It hadn't seemed important. Now it was the only thing I wanted to know, and I understood with a sickening clarity that finding out would mean nothing good. I called Dale the next morning. Who was in the tower before me? Seasonal named Marcus Webb. Good worker. Did 2 full seasons. Where is he now? Transferred to a district office in Bend. Desk job. He requested it. Is he okay? Dale paused in that way he had. He's employed. He checks in. He doesn't talk about Ridgeback. I heard him on the radio last night. Channel 2. Dale didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had that flat quality again. How long did you listen? 1 minute. I switched at 1 minute like the sheet says. Good. Don't go back to Channel 2. Dale. There's nothing I can tell you that the sheet doesn't already cover. I'm not withholding. I genuinely don't have more information than what's on that sheet. The people who wrote it knew more than I do, and they're not around to ask. Just get through the season. I got through the season. I want to say that clearly, because what follows might make it sound like I didn't, or like getting through it cost me something fundamental. It did cost me something, but I got through. The 5th week was the worst. The fog had been unbroken for 9 days straight. No thinning, no glimpse of trees or sky. The cab was a white room in the void. I'd stopped going on afternoon walks because the last time I'd descended the stairs, I'd made it to the ground and looked into the tree line and seen someone standing there. Not moving, not approaching, just standing, 60 or 70 yards away, at the edge where the fog swallowed the forest. A figure, upright, facing the tower. I couldn't see details. The fog was too thick, but the shape was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The proportions were close to human but not committed to it, like a rough draft of a person that hadn't been finalized. I remembered Rule 3, count their fingers. I couldn't see their hands. I couldn't even see if they had hands. The distance was too great, the fog too heavy. I went back up the stairs. I did not go down again until the supply truck came 6 days later, and when the driver, a young guy named Tomas, who clearly did not like driving up the mountain in fog, asked me if everything was okay. I said yes and helped him unload the water jugs and said nothing else. That same week, the thing on the stairs changed its behavior. It had always stopped around step 20. On the 34th night, it climbed to what I estimated was step 35. I could tell because the sound was louder, closer. The creaks were more distinct. I could hear the grain of the wood flexing under weight, and for the first time, after the footsteps stopped, I heard breathing. Not my breathing. The breathing was below me, outside the cab, coming from the staircase. It was slow and even, the breathing of someone resting after a mild exertion, and it was absolutely real. Not wind, not wood settling, breath, in and out. Patient. I pressed my face into the pillow and clenched my jaw and did not make a sound. The breathing continued for what felt like 20 minutes. Then it stopped, and the stairs creaked twice, descending, and then nothing. In the morning, I found a handprint on the hatch. Not on the outside, where rain or fog might explain a watermark. On the underside of the hatch, which was accessible only from the staircase. It was a handprint in condensation, already fading when I opened the hatch at dawn. 5 fingers. Normal proportions. It could have been a human hand. That was worse, somehow. If it had been wrong, too many fingers, too large, I could have categorized it as something other. But it looked like a person's hand. It looked like someone had stood on the stairs, reached up, and pressed their palm flat against the hatch, and waited. I almost quit that day. I sat on the cot, with the satellite phone in my hand, and Dale's number on the screen, and my thumb over the call button. I could feel the weight of the mountain, the trees, the fog pressing against the windows. The tower that had felt like sanctuary now felt like something else. A box at the top of a pole, and things were climbing the pole at night, and the only barrier between me and them was a wooden hatch and a laminated list of rules that no one could explain. I didn't call. I don't know why. Maybe because leaving would have meant that the fog won, and I had spent 2 years letting things win. The job, the relationship, the inertia. Maybe because the tower, even now, was the first place I'd felt like myself in years, and I was afraid that leaving would collapse that I'd drive back to Portland and the person I was becoming up here would evaporate like fog in sunlight. Maybe I was just stubborn. Stubbornness isn't courage, but it works the same hours. I stayed. I followed the rules. I closed the curtains when the lights came. I didn't check the stairs at 1:13. I switched off channel 2 after 60 seconds. I didn't go below the tower. I logged weather and read novels and made coffee and wrote in my journal and waited for the fog to lift. On the 41st night, someone knocked on the door. Not the hatch, the door. The cab had a door that opened onto the top of the staircase, with a small landing. The knocking was 3 slow, evenly spaced impacts. Polite. The kind of knock you'd give at a neighbor's house when you weren't sure if they were home. I was sitting at the desk. My whole body went rigid. A voice, female, tired sounding. "Hello? I'm sorry, I'm lost. I've been walking for hours. Can you help me?" Rule 5. I stood up. I did not go to the door. I spoke loudly enough to be heard through it. "Which trail did you come from?" "The North Fork Connector. I missed the junction about 2 miles back and I've been going in circles." "Please, it's freezing out here," she answered immediately, without pause. Without the confusion of someone who'd been walking in circles in fog for hours and couldn't remember trail names with any certainty. She answered the way someone answers when they've prepared the answer in advance and have been waiting for the question. I said nothing. I stepped back from the door and sat on the cot and pressed my palms against my knees. The woman knocked again. "Hello? Are you there? I can see your light, please." I had left the lamp on. She could see my light. That meant she was on the landing, just outside the door, 53 steps above the forest floor, in dense fog, I checked my watch, 1:47 in the morning. "Please," she said again. Her voice was patient, kind even. It sounded like a real person. It sounded so much like a real person that every decent impulse in me wanted to open the door. What if the rules were wrong? What if this was a real hiker, hypothermic, terrified, and I was sitting in a warm cab with coffee and a propane heater while she froze on my doorstep because of a laminated piece of paper with no author and no date? The knocking stopped. The voice stopped. I sat on the cot for an hour, my heart slugging against my ribs, and listened to nothing. At dawn, I opened the door. The landing was empty. There were no wet footprints. There were no signs that anyone had stood there. But on the railing of the landing, lined up neatly, were 5 small stones. Smooth, river-polished, arranged in a row, evenly spaced. I had never seen them before. They hadn't been there the previous morning. I didn't touch them. I closed the door. I sat at the desk and stared at the laminated sheet and realized that the rules had not just told me what to do. They had told me what was true. The things outside were patient. They were specific. They knocked and spoke and climbed and waited, and they followed protocols of their own that mirrored ours. And the laminated sheet was not a set of survival instructions. It was a treaty, a set of terms negotiated by people I'd never know, based on observations I didn't have access to. describing a coexistence that depended entirely on both sides following the rules. The fog lifted on October 23rd. Not suddenly. It thinned over 3 days, retreating down the ridges in stages, revealing trees and sky and distance in layers, like a painting being uncovered. On the morning of the 23rd, I woke up and saw Mount Adams through the east window, massive and white and impossibly clear, and I stood at the window and cried. Not from relief, from something closer to grief. The mountain was beautiful, and the fog was gone, and the things in the trees were still there. They were just farther away. I finished my season. I packed my duffel, cleaned the cab, restocked what I could, and left the laminated sheet pinned to the wall. Dale drove me down the mountain and asked me how it went, and I said fine. He didn't press. At the trailhead parking lot, he shook my hand and said I was welcome back next season if I wanted. I said I'd think about it. I drove back to Portland. I found a sublease. I got a part-time job at a bookstore, which felt right after a season of reading. I slept normally for the first 2 weeks. I thought about the tower often, but in the way you think about a vivid dream, with decreasing sharpness, the details softening at the edges. Then, in November, on a rainy Tuesday night, I was sitting in the apartment reading. The window was open a few inches because I'd been cooking, and the smoke alarm was sensitive. Rain was tapping against the glass. I had a cup of tea going cold on the side table. It was quiet. It was comfortable. It was the kind of evening that felt specifically designed to help me believe the tower had been an aberration, a pocket of strangeness that existed only in that specific place, at that specific altitude in that specific fog. The radio on my bookshelf crackled. It was an old handheld unit, not the Forest Service radio which I'd returned. This was a cheap weather radio I'd bought at a thrift store years ago for storm tracking. It ran on batteries. It was turned off. I was certain it was turned off because I hadn't used it since before the tower, and the batteries were probably dead anyway. It crackled once, twice, 3 times. I sat very still. The rain tapped the window. The tea cooled. The room was warm and ordinary and mine. I did not respond. I counted to 10. The crackling stopped at 6. Then, from the radio, a voice. Calm, male, conversational. The voice from Channel 2, Marcus Webb or whoever Marcus Webb had become. You left the light on. The radio went silent. I stared at it from across the room. The rain continued. The apartment was still. Nothing else happened that night. But I understood. The tower was not a place I'd visited. It was a place that had visited me. And somewhere on that mountain, in fog or out of it, the light I'd left on, metaphorical or literal, I don't know, was still burning, and things were still climbing toward it, patient and specific, and following rules I'd never fully learn. And the boundary I'd thought was made of altitude and weather, and distance was actually made of something thinner. I still have the weather radio. It sits on the shelf, batteries removed, power switch off. Some nights, when it rains, I think I hear it crackle, and I count to 10, and it stops, and I go to bed. But I don't throw it away, and I don't move it. Because the rules taught me something that Dale never said out loud. You don't solve this. You don't escape it. You manage it. You follow the protocols. You close the curtains. You count to 10, and you live your life in the spaces between the things you've agreed not to look at. The fog always comes back. And somewhere right now, there's a new lookout in that tower, reading a laminated sheet and thinking it's a joke. I hope they read it tonight. I hope they follow every word. Because the stairs will sound occupied at 1:13, and the lights will move below the tower, and something will knock on the door and know exactly what to say. And the only thing between that person and whatever waits on the landing is a list of rules that no one wrote, that no one explains, that everyone follows. And that's enough. It has to be. Because the alternative is opening the door.